Mr. Jordan Shallow, aka the Muscle Doc. We trained legs today. We only did 5 movements today and we kept it fairly simple. I know Jordan's a proponent of keeping things fairly simple. We started with a walking lunge, which may seem simple to a lot of you guys, but there's also a lot of principles and stuff that go into it that prepare you to go into your next exercises. So
4 exercises or 5 exercises, 4th one is a superset. Good principle to follow for most of your training is start with like your most unstable exercise first, and a lot of people like put lunges later in a session. It's like your ability to stabilize your hip, your pelvis, and your spine is only going to decrease as your session moves on. So Tristyn and I had more of like a glute focus, just by the way we loaded with a bar on our back. Tyler and Killian went a little bit more quad focus with a dumbbell, and that's another thing that people don't consider. Like the implement we use and where we put it will affect how we bias particular muscle groups. So you know, all 4 of our stances or stride lengths might look very similar, but based off of just the subtle permutation of like we had a bar on our back and they had a dumbbell in their hands, the center of mass shift between the 2 of us and the 2 of them is going to bias more glute ham for us and more quad. But a lot of people think like biasing glute and hamstring on a lunge means super long strides, which is actually like the opposite. And always think, especially with compound movements like multi-joint lunge, squat, deadlift, like think about bias over isolation. I know it's like weird, like it might be the same thing, but a bias just means we're taking all of the load and just trying to deviate it slightly towards the glute away from the quad, or in their case deviate it slightly towards the quad and away from the glute. Because the second you start isolating with multi-joint exercises, you start decreasing the overall load and your stimulus falls under a threshold that's adaptable, right? So it's like if I tried to isolate my quad, it had this really long, you know, knees way over the toe, but I wasn't using any weight. It's like, okay, we've taken range of motion, we cranked it way up, but we've taken the actual load that we're lifting, we've cranked it way down. And a lot of times we crank the load down so much that the cumulative stress of those 2 variables ends up sub-threshold.
for example, like Tom Platz is known for doing the really hard like knee over toes squat where you're getting this massive range of motion, but you're decreasing the load so much that your output is going down and the overall stimulus to your quads is going down much more. So applying a movement where you can balance the 2, where one's load and then one's getting that active range of motion, is like finding the balance where you're able to drive enough output to actually provide stimulus to the muscle.
Like understanding those 2 key factors of like range of motion and load, how to manipulate those 2 effectively so you have those together create stimulus. For the most part, there's other things that factor in like tempo and density and things like that, but those 2 for the most part when you're organizing exercises, it's like if you have some crazy long range of motion, does the load fall to a point that's relatively, you know, unsubstantial? Now the load can drop in a movement that's isolation, like our quad extension. I mean, we could probably all go full stack on the quad extension, but we're so late in the session, so we were exaggerating like range of motion and tempo and other variables, right? But with like a compound movement like a lunge, where the hip and the spine and the pelvis are all loaded, each one of those has an ability to contribute to the overall movement. So let's try and load that as heavy as possible rather than trying to isolate the glute and doing some stupid glute only movement. It's like, nah, it's gonna bias the glute rather than isolate the glute. So that's just exercise number 1. I think the big takeaway is like we just did lunges. Yeah, it sounds complicated when we talk about it, but it's like we did lunges. I had a bar on my back, Tristyn had a bar on his back, Tyler had dumbbells in his hands, Killian had a dumbbell in his hand. There's a lot of thought that went into it, but there's no thought when we were doing it. Yeah, and I think that's the hard part, right? When we start to talk about like intelligent methods of training, it just gets real nerdy and like no one ends up lifting. It's like the key takeaway is like you actually need to lift the weights. So that was exercise number 1, was walking lunges. We worked up to like 2 working sets of like 12 plus reps per leg, so it was pretty taxing. There's no way you would be able to replicate that output after doing hamstring curls or quad extensions or hack squats. So then we went to prone or lying hamstring curl next. You know, we reiterate like this posterior pelvic tilt position, trying to like integrate the skill of using your hamstring in the shortened position while maintaining a neutral pelvis. A lot of people, when they do that machine, their ass comes up, pelvis dumps forward, lumbar spine goes into extension.
The bicep, probably the easiest muscle group to really emphasize that motion, where you lock one side of the muscle to one point and then you only move the other point. That's how you're stretching and lengthening the muscle itself. You have to lock one point down in order to do that. When you do hamstring curl, if your pelvis is just swinging back and forth like this, you're not actually stretching your hamstring, you're just swinging on an arc like this.
Follow that comparison. So the prone hamstring curl trains the hamstring like in its shortened position. So the hip's relatively extended and then the knee flexes. So let's use the bicep as like a comparison. In this comparison, the pelvis and the scapula are the same, and then obviously like the femur and the humerus are the same. So if I'm doing a bicep in the shortened position, I'm gonna be training like somewhere up here. If I'm doing the hamstring in the shortened position, we're doing the prone hamstring curl. If I did a bicep curl like this, and and then the scapula was moving and the radius was moving, it's like I'm not creating any net tension between the shoulder blade and the radius, or I'm not creating any net tension between the pelvis and the back of the knee. It's just doing this. Like Tristyn said, if I can anchor like approximately, like anchor the origin and take the insertion and start to move it away, it's like, well, now I can create tension. And you can create like a lot of like metabolic stress. Like you can get blood in your hamstrings by arching your back and kicking yourself in the butt. But it's not like a butt kicking competition, right? You'll notice our range of motion is like very stunted. Even we said this during the movement, it's like a very short range, because that's all the hamstring has to do. It's not a glute exercise. We're not trying to go into excessive hip extension and dump into anterior tilt. We're just trying to shorten our hamstring, right? So the range of motion might seem short, but there's a difference between the range of motion of a muscle and the range of motion of a movement. People sit into a machine like that and like, yo, range of motion of the movement. It's like, your hamstring doesn't give a fuck if you can kick yourself in the ass. It's just a matter of like getting that hamstring short without compromising at the pelvis.
Sport specificity wise, if you're going into a movement thinking, I want to lengthen and shorten the muscle, you have to look at that. It's not a squat where you're just trying to maximize the amount of weight you're lifting. You're not going to do a lying leg curl to increase like your squat. You're going because you want to isolate your hamstring, and you want to make sure that you're prioritizing hypertrophy on the hamstring. So the exact same movement would for your bicep on your arm would be a preacher curl. You're not going to go into a preacher curl and swing upwards and backwards like this, where you're moving your shoulder and your scapula and all this shit is moving, because then you're not actually lengthening and shortening your bicep, which is where you're trying to isolate. So whenever you're doing a movement that is so sport specific to bodybuilding, like a lying hamstring curl, like a leg extension, you want to make sure that your origin's pinned to one position, so you're actually allowing that muscle to lengthen and shorten, causing hypertrophy.
Moving on to the hack squat. This is where like we really start to externally stabilize. I don't think if we started with the hack squat first, that we'd have loaded much more than we loaded at that point. Like if we started with the hack squat and then loaded lunges and hamstring curls, the load on our lunges and hamstring curls would undoubtedly be less. Yeah. But if we started with the lunges, that's our best opportunity because we're the most fresh, we're like the least amount of fatigue. Lunges were as heavy as they could have been. The hamstring curls were as heavy as they could have been maintaining that technique. Now switching into like compound movement, externally stabilized, like we were able to push a heavy amount of load despite the fact that we had been working across like really hard across different systems in the other two movements, right? Internal stability was highest with the lunges, still pretty high with the prone hamstring curl, trying to like maintain that pelvis position. Now on the hack squat, it's like fucking send it, right? Like let's just put the headphones in and get to work. And that's, I think, the piece that people miss when they start talking about stability is like, okay, let's put ourselves in a safe position. Let's be like really economical with our breathing. Tristyn and I were talking in between sets about really controlling that bottom inch, that bottom range of motion, where most people like, they're good, then everything falls apart and they crash into the bottom. They use a ton of momentum to come up, where it's like just trying to like be aware of that whole range of motion. Again, biasing the quad. You're never isolating with compound movements. It's not like my glute max wasn't working. So it's like understanding the shift in bias over isolation. It's a compound movement. We isolated the quads with the quad extension in the fourth slot, but we're biasing the quads with heavy load. Like you were board plates aside.
Right, and if I had no glute there, my body wouldn't be able to stabilize and put myself in a position where I'm able to load that much weight onto my quad. So your quad's not going to get as much stimulus if you're not using your glute at all. So it's not about completely take my glute out of it necessarily, because in that bottom range of the motion, your body works a certain way for a certain reason. Your glute is going to work to stabilize so that you're not completely putting all of that load on your quad and your knee joint or whatever it may be, because then you're going to blow your knee out.
Yeah, so I mean, there's really not much to it. Like find a good foot position that allows you to like, basically there's an angle that you can draw between like your shin and your leg. Make sure that this angle here is bigger than this angle here, as far as at the beginning and at the end. So like we see a bigger change in bias at the knee versus change of bias at the hip. This just means that we're loading more knee extension, more quad, than we're loading hip extension with glute. Again, like Tristyn said, we're not using our glutes. We're just trying to shift like one standard deviation towards quad. Not have this full on like Tom Platz crazy heels elevated, like put on your fucking girlfriend's stilettos and just be straight into the knee joint, because then all the load would decrease, right? So we were able to do, like, I think those are really effective reps for all of us, because it was a ton of weight and it was a really good bias towards the knee joint and the quad without sacrificing load and output.
Jordan's actually applying the science behind it. What is the function of your quad? Is it at your knee? Is it at your hip? When you look at that and you say, okay, If I'm gonna be doing extension here, that's gonna activate my quad. That's where he's talking about the knee angle and the hip angle.
It all can sound complicated, but just watch the video. Like, we're just doing hack squats heavy. All the thinking was happening before we set up the workout.
And it's put into the machine. The machine is set up a certain way so that it does bias a certain muscle group. Now, some machines given are set up absolutely shit, like we said, but that's why you pick the machines that are going to work before you get into the workout, so that when you're on your third exercise, you've already done all your internally stabilized movements, you're brain dead basically, you can go into that hack squat, lock yourself in, your pelvis is stabilized, you can push into the pad, you don't have to worry about your core as much, you're ready, your lats are already in a good position to lock in here, your breathing's in a good position, you can just drive the output.
Superset to finish. So we finished with a seated quad extension, which is obviously high output quad shortened position, with a front foot elevated, rear foot elevated split squat. Now, like, that might sound so silly and redundant, but I think it's worth having a conversation around what elevating the front foot and elevating the back foot does. So obviously we elevated the back foot to find a stretch in that quad.
In the back,
right? In the rear quad, right? So most people load like a split squat to load into the front leg. We're actually loading the split squat because we want to load the quad in the lengthened position, right? So if we think about it, like, muscles have these compartments, and in these compartments blood goes. That's how we're able to catch a pump, right? Like, if pressure was able to move across the entire gradient of our body, pumps wouldn't exist. We need a closed system that can actually collect this blood. So muscles have kind of two properties. They have more, but like, as far as we're concerned today, a contractile property and an elastic property. So think about like filling up this balloon with water. Let's stick with like a water balloon as a comparison to a muscle. Like, we fill up the quad with blood. Now it's like we have way more elastic recoil potential. So the idea with this last exercise is like, let's use the quad extension to fucking jam as much blood into the quad as we can after the hack squat, which again was compound biasing the quad. Now we're straight isolation, all in, full send quad. Then take that fucking full balloon with maybe not a lot of contractile potential, but a fuck ton of elastic potential. Right? So you ever seen Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory?
Yeah.
Where like the chick eats the blueberry pie, Violet Beauregard,
and then it just expands.
Right. Yeah. So like, that's what we're thinking about our quad, and it's like we want to get it so it like fills up the entire room, and then we try and stretch it. You know, the first couple reps actually feel kind of good. If we load into that like lengthened
quad, you're
quad,
opening up that space for the blood to come in.
But then it's like you open up the space for the blood to come in, and then it's like, oh, it feels pretty good, and then the blood comes in, and you're like, fuck, this sucks.
And then you're lying on the floor for 3 days and can't understand why your legs hurt.
Or you're Tyler, you're like passing out.
Yeah.
Too much blood in his quads, not enough in his brain. So that's kind of the principle behind that last movement, is like, all right, we've worked a continuum from skill to output. Now let's try and challenge like a fully lengthened position, because contractile properties across the board in our legs are probably fucked, right? From glute to hamstring to quad. Let's try and utilize what's left of that elastic property. And we can't use an elastic property in a shortened position, right? So if we switch those exercises and went Bulgarian first and then seated quad extension after, it would negatively affect both of the outputs of each of the movements, right? So we have it so it's like boop, 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 and then just fucking stretch it out. Find more room to put blood into it. So that's kind of like how I think about the last piece, was like, all right, let's try and play off this elastic property of muscle and try and look at like a different stimulus of hypertrophy, right? There's different mechanisms to hypertrophy. So just trying to use that contractile property to just really empty all tanks sort of thing.
I know this all sounds like a lot of science, a lot of principles, a lot of execution tips, all of this different stuff coming together that's very difficult to comprehend. And even for me, as I'm learning, we went through this seminar this weekend and spent hours and hours and hours going through it. I can't even begin to comprehend all the different things that you have to put into your training. So obviously good being able to work with people like Jordan, who has so much experience in this field. And with the channel and stuff, what I wanted to do was kind of branch out from my general go in, shoot my 4 exercises and what you see in the gym, and give a little bit more of the thought process behind it. Because when you're in the gym, it's time to execute. You're not necessarily thinking about programming, what exercises am I gonna do, or am I gonna put my skill exercise first, am I gonna put my output exercise first. When you're in the gym, you're focused on that intensity. So when you look at it from this perspective and you learn the science behind it, then it allows for you guys to apply that to your training. So that's something that I want to bring to the channel more, not necessarily just me flexing and posing in most of the videos. And I think that's what I'm going to shift more of my content to. You may even see some videos videos where my shirt remains on. It didn't in this one, but any specific topics, especially with Jordan while we're here, I mean, he's always around, and I'm super grateful that he's been willing to shoot. Make sure you check out all of his content because he has so much to offer, and we're going to continue building this platform based off of knowledge and information that you guys can learn from as well, not just me, as I said, taking my shirt off, showing my glutes, and getting demonetized potentially. So if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and we'll catch you in the next one. Peace.